On the morning of July 12, 1945, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sat alone in his office at Yokosuka Naval Base, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from the Combined Fleet headquarters. The papers spread across his desk told a story so overwhelming, so mathematically absolute, that even after months of watching it unfold, he still found himself checking the numbers again. American carrier strength in the Pacific Theater: 147 fleet, light, and escort carriers operational or under construction. Japan had 4 carriers remaining. 4. And of those 4, only 1 could actually operate aircraft. The ratio was 37-1. Ozawa had spent his entire career studying naval warfare, carrier doctrine, and fleet tactics. He understood what ratios meant. A 2-1 advantage was significant. A 5-1 advantage was overwhelming. But 37-1? That was mathematics. The Americans were not fighting Japan with superior tactics, or better training, or more aggressive commanders. They were burying Japan under numbers so vast that tactical brilliance became irrelevant. And the most painful part, the part that kept Ozawa awake at night, was that Japan had seen this coming. They had known, and they had gone to war anyway. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japan entered World War II with the finest carrier force ever assembled. 6 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, all modern, all battle-tested, all crewed by pilots who had been training for years. The Kido Butai, the Mobile Strike Force, was the most powerful naval aviation formation in human history. No nation could match it. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated what concentrated carrier power could accomplish. 353 aircraft launched from 6 carriers, striking targets across Oahu with devastating precision. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2,400, 3 Americans killed. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. The exchange ratio was so one-sided it seemed to confirm everything the Japanese Navy believed about carrier warfare and their own superiority. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the Combined Fleet, understood something his colleagues refused to accept. Japan had won a tactical victory that guaranteed strategic defeat. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaches in Washington throughout the 1920s. He had toured American factories, walked through American shipyards, driven through American cities. He understood American industrial capacity in ways that no amount of intelligence reports could convey. He told the Japanese government before the war that Japan could win battles for 6 months, perhaps 1 year. After that, American industrial power would produce weapons and ships at rates Japan could never match. The government ignored him. They believed fighting spirit could overcome industrial capacity. They believed the warrior culture of Japan gave them advantages that factories could not duplicate. They believed Americans were soft, undisciplined, unwilling to sustain casualties in a prolonged war. Every one of these beliefs was wrong. And by the time Japanese leadership understood how wrong they were, the war was already lost. The first carrier Japan lost was Shoho, sunk on May 7, 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. She went down after taking 13 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes from American carrier aircraft. Shoho was a light carrier, 11,000 tons, converted from a submarine tender. She carried 30 aircraft. Her loss was significant, but not catastrophic. 1 month later, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day at Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, all sunk by American dive bombers in a battle that lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Those 4 carriers represented 20 years of Japanese naval development, 40,000 tons of irreplaceable combat power, and 250 aircraft with their pilots and maintenance crews. The Japanese naval staff in Tokyo received the Midway reports and immediately began calculating replacement timelines. They were professional officers. They understood logistics. They knew ship construction took time. Akagi had taken 4 years to build. Kaga had taken 6 years. Soryu took 3 years. Hiryu took 4 years. Average construction time, 4¼ years per fleet carrier. 4 ships lost. 17 years of construction time to replace them if they built sequentially. Japan had 3 major shipyards capable of building fleet carriers: Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Kure Naval Arsenal, and Kawasaki Shipyard in Kobe. All 3 were working at maximum capacity building destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and merchant ships to replace combat losses and support offensive operations throughout the Pacific. To replace 4 fleet carriers would require dedicating all 3 yards to carrier construction exclusively for nearly 6 years. That meant no destroyers to screen the carriers, no cruisers to provide anti-aircraft defense, no submarines to interdict American supply lines, no merchant ships to transport fuel, food, ammunition, and reinforcements to forward bases. Japan could not afford that. The war required everything: every ship, every resource, every worker. The naval staff made a decision that seemed logical at the time. They would complete Taiho, which had been laid down before Pearl Harbor. They would convert merchant ships and seaplane tenders into light carriers. They would design a new class of smaller, cheaper carriers that could be built faster. The Pete plan looked reasonable. Taiho would provide fleet carrier capability. The conversions would provide interim replacements. The new Unryu class carriers would eventually restore Japan's numerical strength. The plan failed completely. Taiho's keel had been laid on July 10th, 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor. The ship was launched on April 7th, 1943. She was commissioned on March 7th, 1944, 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. That was actually fast for a Japanese fleet carrier. Shokaku and Zuikaku, laid down in late 1937, had taken 44 and 45 months respectively. Japan had improved its carrier construction timeline significantly. 32 months was an achievement. The problem was what the Americans were doing in that same time period. The Americans commissioned USS Essex on December 31st, 1942. Her keel had been laid on April 28, 1941. 20 months from keel to commissioning. The Essex was larger than Taiho. She displaced 27,100 tons standard compared to Taiho's 29,300 tons. She carried 90 aircraft compared to Taiho's 75. 20 months. The Americans had built a larger, more capable carrier in 37% less time than Japan's fastest construction program. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Essex was just the first. In January 1943, Lexington was commissioned, then Yorktown, then Bunker Hill, then Intrepid, then Hornet, then Franklin. By December 1943, the Americans had commissioned 11 Essex-class carriers, 11 fleet carriers in 1 year. Japan commissioned Taiho, 1 carrier in 32 months. The Americans built 11 fleet carriers in 12 months. The mathematical impossibility of Japan's strategic position was becoming visible to anyone willing to see, but the Japanese naval staff was not willing to see it. Not yet. Admiral Ozawa received his first command of carrier forces in November 1942, when he relieved Admiral Chuichi Nagumo as commander of the Third Fleet. Nagumo had led the Kido Butai at Pearl Harbor and Midway. After Midway, the Navy needed someone new, someone who could rebuild the carrier force from the catastrophic losses, someone who understood carrier doctrine deeply enough to adapt to the new strategic reality. Ozawa was that someone. He was a torpedo and surface warfare expert who had commanded 1st Carrier Division before the war. He had learned from air-minded subordinates like Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike. Ozawa understood both surface tactics and aviation tactics. He was the right man for the job. But no amount of tactical skill could overcome the industrial gap that was opening between Japan and the United States. The gap wasn't small, it was absolute. And it was widening every month. By early 1944, Ozawa commanded the 1st Mobile Fleet, Japan's primary carrier strike force. On paper, His command looked formidable. 9 carriers. 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 converted carriers, Junyo and Hio. 4 light carriers, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. 9 carriers carrying a total of 473 aircraft. That was a powerful strike force by any historical standard. The Americans deployed 15 carriers to oppose him at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 Independence-class light carriers. Those 15 carriers embarked 956 aircraft, more than twice Ozawa's total. The battle was not close. On June 19th, Japan launched 4 major airstrikes against the American task force. 400 aircraft committed to destroying American carriers and stopping the invasion of Saipan. American radar detected every strike wave at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter directors vectored Hellcat fighters onto the incoming Japanese formations before they reached the American fleet. The Japanese called it attacking the Americans. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Of 400 aircraft launched, 300 were shot down. 70% losses in a single day. The pilots who died represented years of training that Japan could never replace. The maintenance crews who went down with their carriers represented institutional knowledge that took decades to build. The aircraft themselves represented industrial capacity that Japan no longer possessed. On June 19, 1944, Japan lost 3 fleet carriers. Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, was hit by a single torpedo from the American submarine Albacore. The damage should have been manageable. Japanese damage control doctrine was adequate for single torpedo hits. But a young damage control officer made a critical error. He ordered the ship's ventilation system turned on to clear gasoline fumes from the hangar deck. The ventilation system spread the fumes throughout the ship instead of venting them overboard. 6 hours after the torpedo hit, a spark ignited the gasoline vapor. The explosion tore the ship apart from the inside. Taiho sank in minutes, taking 1,272 men with her. 32 months to build, 3 months in service. Gone. Shokaku, one of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, veteran of Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and a dozen other operations, was hit by 4 torpedoes from the submarine Kavala. She sank 7 hours later. Hio was hit by aerial torpedoes and bombs during the American counterattack on June 20th. She caught fire, lost power, and sank. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers in 2 days. The Americans lost 0. After the Philippine Sea, Ozawa withdrew the surviving carriers to Japan. He spent months rebuilding the air groups, training new pilots, preparing for the next major engagement. But there was a problem he could not solve. A problem that made everything else irrelevant. Japan was running out of fuel. The American submarine campaign had become devastatingly effective. Japanese merchant shipping losses exceeded construction by wide margins every month. The fuel that carriers needed to operate, the aviation gasoline that aircraft needed to fly, the heavy oil that boilers needed to generate steam, all of it came through sea lanes that American submarines controlled. By October 1944, Japan's remaining carriers could barely sortie from port. When Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, ordered the Japanese Navy to defend the Philippines against American invasion in October 1944, Ozawa commanded 4 carriers, 4. Zuikaku, the last of the original 6 that attacked Pearl Harbor, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, all light carriers. Those 4 carriers embarked 108 aircraft total. Not because the carriers lacked capacity. Zuikaku alone could operate 75 aircraft when fully equipped. They had 108 aircraft because Japan had no more aircraft to give them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had destroyed the trained pilots. The submarine campaign had destroyed the fuel supplies. The American bombing campaign had destroyed the aircraft factories. Ozawa knew his carriers could not fight effectively with 108 aircraft against the American task forces that now regularly deployed 500 or more aircraft. He proposed using his carriers as bait instead. Sail the carriers north from Japan, clearly visible to American reconnaissance. Draw the American fast carriers away from Leyte Gulf, where the main Japanese battleship force would attack the American invasion fleet. It was a suicide mission, tactically, but it might achieve something strategically if the battleships could reach the invasion. Transports. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, took the bait exactly as Ozawa planned. On October 25, 1944, Halsey took every carrier in Task Force 38 North to pursue Ozawa's decoy force. That left the landing area at Leyte Gulf protected only by escort carriers. The plan should have worked, but the Japanese battleship force failed to coordinate properly. American escort carriers fought desperately. American destroyers conducted suicidal torpedo attacks against battleships 10 times their size, and the Japanese battleship commanders, unused to operating without air cover, became cautious at the critical moment. The opportunity was lost. Meanwhile, Halsey's carriers found Ozawa's decoy force and destroyed it methodically. All 4 carriers sunk. Zuikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, went down after multiple bomb and torpedo hits. She had survived 35 months of war. She operated in more major engagements than any carrier in history. And in the end, she died as bait, carrying barely enough aircraft to defend herself, let alone attack the enemy. After Leyte Gulf, Japan had no operational fleet carriers. None. The Japanese Navy still existed on paper. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines. But without carriers, without air cover, those ships could not operate in areas where American carrier aircraft could reach them. And by late 1944, American carrier aircraft could reach everywhere in the Pacific that mattered. Ozawa was appointed commander of the Third Fleet after Leyte Gulf. Then, on May 29, 1945, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, replacing Admiral Toyoda. It was the highest position in the Japanese Navy. Under normal circumstances, an officer appointed to command the combined fleet would be promoted to full admiral. Ozawa refused the promotion. He remained a vice-admiral. He was the only wartime commander of the combined fleet who did not become an admiral. Perhaps he understood that commanding what remained of the combined fleet in July 1945 was not an honor. It was a burden, a mathematical impossibility made flesh. Ozawa's intelligence staff provided regular updates on American naval strength in the Pacific. The numbers grew every week. Every month brought new American carriers, new American battleships, new American cruisers and destroyers, and submarines and support ships. The American industrial machine was producing vessels faster than Japan could count them. By July 1945, American intelligence estimated Japan had 4 carriers remaining. Hosho, the experimental carrier commissioned in 1922, used for training. Katsuragi, an Unryu-class carrier completed in October 1944, but never made operational due to lack of fuel and aircraft. Ryuho, a converted submarine tender, damaged and under repair. Junyo, damaged multiple times, under repair at Kure. Of those 4, only Hosho could operate aircraft, and Hosho was obsolete, capable of carrying perhaps 15 aircraft, useful only for basic training operations near the home islands where American fighters were unlikely to find her. 4 carriers. Japan began the war with 9 operational carriers and had commissioned 9 more during wartime construction, 18 total. 14 were sunk. 4 remained, and only 1 could fly aircraft. Meanwhile, Ozawa's intelligence staff counted American carriers. The count was methodical and depressing. Essex-class fleet carriers, 24 commissioned. Independence-class light carriers, 9 commissioned. And then there were the escort carriers. The Casablanca class alone totaled 50 carriers built by Henry Kaiser's shipyards. 50 carriers in 15 months, 1 carrier every 9 days. The Bogue class, the Sangamon class, the Commencement Bay class. Escort carriers built on merchant hulls, built quickly, built cheaply, built in numbers that seemed impossible. The intelligence staff counted American carrier strength in July 1945 and reached a total that required verification. 147 American carriers commissioned or under construction. Fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers combined. 147. The number was so large that Ozawa ordered his staff to recount it using different sources. Radio intercept data identifying carrier call signs in different task forces. Reconnaissance photographs of American bases showing carriers moored at piers. Captured documents listing carrier deployments. Intelligence reports from neutral nations observing American naval movements. Every source confirmed it. The Americans had 147 carriers. Ozawa had 4. The ratio was 36 3/4 to 1. But that ratio actually understated the true gap. Because of those 4 Japanese carriers, only 1 could operate. Of the 147, American carriers, more than 100 were operational and actively deployed. Some were in the Pacific hammering Japanese positions. Some were in the Atlantic supporting European operations or conducting training. Some were in shipyards undergoing repairs or modifications. But all of them could fight. All of them had trained crews, adequate fuel, functioning aircraft, and operational support systems. Japan's 4 carriers had none of those things. No fuel, no aircraft, no trained pilots, no spare parts. They existed on paper, but they were effectively museum pieces, static defenses at best. The Americans weren't just building carriers faster than Japan, they were building them faster than Japan could comprehend. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard, producing escort carriers at an average rate of 1 every 8 to 10 days. Newport News Shipbuilding, launching Essex-class fleet carriers every 14 to 16 months. Multiple carriers under construction simultaneously at different shipyards across the country. A carrier production system that operated like an assembly line. Japan had built 9 carriers during the entire war, 4 years of total war mobilization, 9 carriers. The Americans built 100 to 7 carriers in that same period. The ratio was 11.8 to 1. Almost 12 American carriers for every Japanese carrier built during wartime. And that 11.8 to 1 construction ratio translated into a current operational ratio of over 100 to 1. Ozawa sat in his office at Yokosuka on July 12, 1945, looking at the intelligence summary. He thought about the conversations he had participated in before the war. The planning sessions where officers discussed fighting spirit and warrior culture and the superiority of Japanese training. The confidence, bordering on arrogance, that had pervaded naval headquarters in 1941. We are better trained. Our pilots have more experience. Our carriers are more modern. Our tactics are more aggressive. The Americans are soft. They will not sustain a long war. They will negotiate after early defeats. All of it wrong. Every assumption, every belief, every confident prediction. All wrong. The Americans had sustained the war for 3.5 years. They had absorbed losses that would have destroyed Japan's will to fight and come back stronger every time. They had built carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They had trained pilots faster than Japan could kill them. They had produced aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. And they had done all of it while simultaneously fighting a full-scale war in Europe against Germany. Japan had entered the war believing they faced an enemy with limited industrial capacity, limited manpower, and limited will to fight. They had been wrong about all 3, catastrophically wrong. The intelligence failure began before Pearl Harbor. Japanese naval intelligence had studied American industrial capacity extensively. They knew American steel production exceeded Japan's by ratios of 8 to 1 or 10 to 1. They knew American shipbuilding capacity was larger. They knew American population was almost twice Japan's. The raw data was available. But having data is not the same as understanding what the data means. Japanese intelligence officers looked at American capacity and made assumptions about how that capacity would be used. They assumed American mobilization would follow patterns similar to Japanese mobilization. Careful, methodical, prioritizing quality over quantity. They assumed building a navy required the same careful approach Japan used. They assumed training sailors and pilots took years, not months. They assumed industrial production required specialized facilities that took years to build and years to bring to full capacity. Every assumption was based on Japanese experience. Japanese shipyards built ships the traditional way: lay a keel, build up from the bottom, rivet steel plates together, install engines, launch the hull, spend months finishing the interior, 6 months to a year for a destroyer, 2 to 3 years for a cruiser, 3 to 5 years for a carrier. That was how ship construction worked. That was how it had always worked. The Americans didn't follow those rules. Henry Kaiser, the man who revolutionized American ship construction, had never built a ship before 1941. He was a construction engineer who built dams: the Hoover Dam, the Bonneville Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam. Massive concrete structures that required moving mountains of material and coordinating thousands of workers. When the United States Maritime Commission needed cargo ships in 1941, Kaiser proposed building them like dam sections, prefabricate components in separate facilities, assemble them at the shipway, weld everything instead of riveting. Traditional shipbuilders said it was impossible. Welding was risky. Welded seams could fail. Cracks could propagate through welds and break a ship in half. Kaiser said he would take the risk. He built 4 shipyards in Richmond, California. He hired workers who had never seen a ship before, women from farms. African Americans excluded from traditional shipyard work, anyone willing to learn. He didn't care about experience. He cared about organization. He divided ship construction into modules. Each module built in a separate shop by workers who only needed to know how to weld that specific piece. The modules were built on their sides or upside down, whatever orientation made welding easiest. Then moved to the shipway with cranes, lowered into position, welded together. The first Liberty ship Kaiser built took 196 days. The 10th took 45 days. By 1943, Kaiser's yards were completing Liberty ships in an average of 42 days. The record was 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in November 1942 as a publicity stunt, 4 days to build a cargo ship. Traditional shipbuilders had said 6 months minimum. The Japanese naval intelligence apparatus monitored American ship construction. They received reports from naval attachés in Washington. They read technical publications that documented construction programs. They knew the Americans were building fast, but they couldn't conceive that the same techniques used for cargo ships would work for carriers. Carriers were complex. They required specialized equipment, trained workers, years of expertise. Kaiser proposed building escort carriers using the same prefabrication methods. Small carriers built on merchant hulls, designed for convoy protection rather than fleet actions. The Navy was skeptical. Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard laid the keel for the escort carrier Casablanca on November 3, 1942. The ship was launched on April 5, 1943. Commissioned on July 8, 1943. 8 months from keel to commissioning. The Navy wanted 50 escort carriers. Kaiser delivered 50 Casablanca-class carriers in 14 months. 1 carrier every 8.4 days. The Japanese naval staff in Tokyo received intelligence reports about Kaiser's production rates and assumed they were errors. 1 carrier every 8 days was physically impossible, but the reports kept coming, confirmed by multiple sources. Reconnaissance photographs showing rows of carriers at Kaiser's Vancouver shipyard. Radio intercepts revealing carrier call signs appearing in the Pacific faster than construction timelines should allow. Combat encounters with escort carriers that shouldn't exist yet according to projected commissioning dates. The numbers were real. The Americans were producing carriers at rates that violated every principle of naval construction that Japanese officers understood. And it wasn't just escort carriers. The Essex-class fleet carriers were arriving in squadron strength. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia had been building carriers since the 1930s. They knew carrier construction took years, but they learned from Kaiser's methods. They started prefabricating carrier components, hull sections, hangar decks, flight decks, island superstructures, all built in separate shops, then moved to the shipway for final assembly. They replaced riveting with welding wherever possible. They standardized designs so every Essex-class carrier used identical plans, identical components, identical equipment. Workers learned to build one module, then built dozens of identical modules. They streamlined construction sequences. Instead of waiting for one section to be completed before starting the next, multiple sections were built simultaneously in different locations, then brought together. USS Franklin, built at Newport News, was laid down on December 7, 1942, launched on October 14, 1943, commissioned on January 31, 1944, 13 months from keel to commissioning. Several Essex-class carriers were completed in 14 to 16 months. The average was 18 months. Japan's Taiho took 32 months. American shipyards were building fleet carriers nearly twice as fast as Japanese shipyards. The gap extended beyond construction speed to sheer numbers. By the time Taiho was commissioned in March 1944, the Americans had 17 Essex-class carriers commissioned or under construction, 17 to 1. The ratio was worse when including light carriers and escort carriers. By mid-1944, America operated more than 100 carriers of all types. Japan had 9. By July 1945, those ratios had become even more extreme. Japan tried to adapt. They ordered 14 Unryu-class carriers. These were smaller than Taiho, simpler to build, designed for mass production based on the pre-war Hiryu design. They displaced 17,150 tons, carried 65 aircraft, could make 34 knots. They were supposed to be Japan's answer to the Essex class. 3 were completed. Unryu, commissioned August 6, 1944. Amaji, commissioned August 10, 1944. Katsuragi, commissioned October 15, 1944. 3 carriers in 10 weeks seemed like progress, except the Americans commissioned 9 Essex-class carriers in that same 10-week period. Japan couldn't catch up. Every time they accelerated production, the Americans accelerated faster. And worse, Japan was running out of resources. Building a carrier requires steel. An Essex-class carrier contained approximately 27,000 tons of steel plate, structural steel, and armor plate. The United States produced 80 million tons of steel in 1944. Japan produced 6 million tons. The American steel industry was producing more than 13 times more steel than Japan's entire industrial capacity. That steel gap rippled through every aspect of naval construction. American shipyards had steel. If a section was damaged or incorrectly built, they scrapped it and built a new one. Japanese shipyards rationed steel. Every plate was precious. Mistakes had to be fixed, not replaced. American shipyards had modern machine tools. Japanese shipyards rationed machine tools. Many were old, worn, breaking down. Replacement parts were scarce. American shipyards employed 2 million workers by 1943. Japanese shipyards employed 300,000 workers total, spread across dozens of projects. The workforce gap was 6.7 to 1. The Americans could specialize. One crew built bulkheads, another built deck sections, another installed machinery. Specialization increased speed. Japanese workers had to be generalists, capable of doing everything, which made them flexible but slower. The gap extended to logistics. American shipyards received steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, and electronics by rail and truck from factories across the continent. If one supplier had problems, alternatives existed. Japanese shipyards depended on shipping. Steel came from mills in Korea and Manchuria. Copper came from mines in the Philippines. Rubber came from the Dutch East Indies. All transported by merchant ships that American submarines were sinking at catastrophic rates. By 1944, Japan was losing merchant shipping faster than shipyards could replace it. Critical materials weren't arriving. Construction programs were delayed because shipyards waited for steel plate, turbine blades, electrical cable. Taiho had been designed with 8 boilers and 4 turbines producing 160,000 shaft horsepower. 2 of the Unryu carriers, Katsuragi and Aso, were built with destroyer engines because turbine manufacturers couldn't produce fleet carrier power plants fast enough. Those carriers could only make 25 knots instead of 34 knots. Slower carriers meant less tactical flexibility, less ability to evade attacks, less ability to close with enemy forces or retreat from danger. The Americans faced no such compromises. Every Essex-class carrier had identical propulsion systems, 150,000 shaft horsepower, 33 knots, no exceptions. The pattern repeated across every category of comparison: fuel capacity, aircraft complement, radar systems, anti-aircraft armament, damage control capability. Every measure favored the Americans, usually by factors of 2 to 1 or greater. But the truly decisive advantage was in the training pipeline. Japan entered the war with the best-trained carrier pilots in the world. Pilots trained for 2 years before their first carrier landing. They practiced navigation, gunnery, formation, flying, night operations, carrier approaches, until they could execute complex maneuvers instinctively. By 1943, Japan didn't have 2 years to train pilots. They didn't have 1 year. American submarine warfare was destroying merchant shipping, which meant less fuel for training flights. Pilot training programs were shortened from 24 months to 12 months, then to 8 months, then to 6 months. Pilots graduated to fleet squadrons with 100 flight hours instead of 500. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, was pulled from combat in early 1943 to serve as a flight instructor. He was shocked by what he found. The training program was overwhelmed. Instructors had too many students. Classes were rushed. Fundamental skills were being skipped because there wasn't time to teach them properly. Sakai later wrote that instructors were told to rush men through, forget the fine points, just teach them how to fly and shoot. The pilots who graduated from these abbreviated programs were sent to carrier, squadrons to fill out air groups. They were brave. They were dedicated. They were willing to die for their country. But they weren't ready. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots averaged 20 hours of combat flight time. Some had none. They were flying their first carrier operation against American pilots, who averaged 200 hours of combat flight time. The result was predictable and brutal. 300 Japanese aircraft shot down in one day. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name was dismissive, but accurate. It wasn't a battle between equals. It was slaughter. And Japan had no way to replace the losses. Every pilot killed represented 6 months to a year of training. Every aircraft destroyed represented industrial capacity Japan no longer possessed. Every carrier sunk removed capability that could never be recovered. By July 1945, Japan had effectively no trained carrier pilots. The handful of veterans who survived 3.5 years of combat were too valuable to risk in operations. They were instructors, training the next generation that would never have time to become combat effective before the war ended. Ozawa understood all of this with painful clarity. He had commanded carrier forces through the 2 most devastating battles of the war. He had watched Japan's carrier power disintegrate under the weight of American numerical superiority. He had submitted resignation letters after Philippine Sea. They were rejected. He had led his carriers on a suicide mission at Leyte Gulf, using them as bait to draw American forces out of position. The mission succeeded tactically. The carriers died as planned, but the strategic objective failed because the surface forces couldn't capitalize on the opportunity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Now, in July 1945, Ozawa commanded a combined fleet that existed only on paper. 4 carriers that couldn't fight, battleships that couldn't sortie without air cover, cruisers and destroyers scattered across harbors where American carrier aircraft found them daily. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war as the 3rd most powerful navy in the world, had been reduced to a coastal defense force unable to protect even its own bases, and Ozawa knew exactly why. The intelligence reports on his desk told the story in numbers that were absolute and unforgiving. 147 American carriers, 4 Japanese carriers. The ratio was not just a tactical disadvantage. It was mathematical proof of strategic impossibility. Japan had lost the war not because of tactical errors or strategic miscalculations or insufficient fighting spirit. Japan lost because they entered a war against an enemy whose industrial capacity was so vast that tactical and strategic brilliance became irrelevant. American carrier strength in July 1945 represented the full flowering of industrial mobilization on a scale Japan never imagined possible. Every carrier represented workers who learned shipbuilding in weeks instead of years. Every carrier represented steel mills producing at rates Japanese planners considered impossible. Every carrier represented a logistics system that could move resources across a continent and turn them into warships faster than traditional methods could produce individual components. The Americans weren't better warriors. They weren't braver. They weren't more dedicated to their cause. They were simply more numerous. So much more numerous that numbers overcame every other advantage Japan possessed. Ozawa would later be interviewed by American naval intelligence officers on October 30, 1945. They asked him about Japanese carrier operations, about the planning for Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, about the decision-making process that led to specific tactical choices. Ozawa answered their questions candidly. He was a professional officer, being interviewed by other professional officers. There was no point in evasions or excuses. The war was over. The outcome was decided. What remained was understanding how it happened. When asked about the factors that led to Japanese defeat, Ozawa emphasized the industrial gap. The Americans could absorb losses and return stronger. Japan could not. The Americans could train replacement pilots in months. Japan needed years. The Americans had fuel, steel, aluminum, rubber, everything required for sustained operations. Japan had none of those things by 1944. But perhaps the most revealing moment in the interrogation came when an American officer asked Ozawa whether accurate intelligence about American industrial capacity would have changed Japanese strategy. Ozawa paused before answering. The question assumed that strategy could have compensated for industrial disadvantage. That tactical brilliance or operational innovation could have overcome a 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 or 30-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Ozawa's answer was diplomatic but clear. If Japanese planners had known in 1941 that America would deploy over 2 million sailors and more than 100 carriers by 1945, the entire strategic calculus would have been different. Not necessarily different enough to avoid war, given the oil embargo and resource constraints Japan faced, but different enough to fight a different kind of war. Limited objectives instead of expansive conquest, defensive strategies instead of offensive operations, earlier negotiation attempts before the situation became hopeless. The war that actually occurred, with total commitment to offensive operations and categorical rejection of compromise until final defeat, was only possible because Japanese leaders at all levels believed they fought an enemy with limited resources who would eventually tire of the conflict. That belief was wrong from the beginning, and the intelligence failure that created and sustained that belief cost Japan everything. The mathematical reality of carrier strength in July 1945 proved it. 147 American carriers operational or under construction. 4 Japanese carriers remaining, only 1 capable of operating aircraft. The ratio was absolute. The outcome was inevitable. And Ozawa, sitting in his office at Yokosuka reading intelligence summaries, understood that Japan had been defeated not on any battlefield, but in the shipyards of Newport News and Richmond and Vancouver, where American workers who had never built ships before 1942 produced more carriers in 4 years than Japan had built in 2 decades. The title of this story is nearly accurate. Japanese admirals did count American carrier strength in 1945 and reached totals around 147 when including all fleet, light, and escort carriers commissioned or under advanced construction. The exact number varies depending on how you count vessels in different stages of construction, or vessels transferred to other navies or vessels converted for other purposes. But 147 is well within the range of accurate estimates for American carrier strength at that point in the war. Japan had 4 carriers remaining. The ratio was approximately 37-1. That ratio, more than any battle or any admiral's genius or any tactical innovation, tells the complete story of how industrial capacity determined the outcome of the carrier war in the Pacific. The 4 carriers that remained in the Japanese inventory by July 1945 each told their own story of decline and desperation. Hosho, commissioned in December 1922, was the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier. She displaced 7,470 tons, could make 25 knots, and carried 26 aircraft when fully equipped. By 1945, Hosho was relegated to training duties in the inland sea. She was too small, too slow, and too obsolete to operate with fleet units. But she could still launch and recover aircraft, which made her valuable for teaching student pilots the fundamentals of carrier operations. Not that Japan had fuel to spare for training flights. By mid-1945, most training consisted of ground instruction. Students studied carrier procedures in classrooms rather than practicing them on actual flight decks. Hosho survived the war intact. American carrier aircraft never found her hiding in the inland sea among the dozens of other training vessels and auxiliaries that crowded Japanese home waters. After the surrender, she was used briefly for repatriation duties, bringing Japanese soldiers and civilians home from overseas. Then she was scrapped in 1947. 25 years of service. She had outlived every other Japanese carrier by virtue of being too obsolete to risk in combat operations. Katsuragi, the last of the Unryu-class carriers to be completed, was commissioned on October 15, 1944. She displaced 17,150 tons, was designed to carry 65 aircraft, and should have been capable of 34 knots with her designed power plant. But Katsuragi was completed with destroyer turbines instead of purpose-built carrier engines. She could barely make 25 knots, and even that required fuel Japan didn't have. Katsuragi never operated with the fleet. She was commissioned at a time when Japan had no aircraft to spare, no trained pilots, and no fuel for operations. She spent her entire brief career moored at Kure, camouflaged against air attack, her flight deck empty, her hangar deck empty, her machinery cold. On July 28, 1945, American carrier aircraft attacked Kure Naval Base in one of the final major strikes of the war. Katsuragi was hit but survived, protected by camouflage that made her less visible than the battleships and cruisers that drew American attention. After the war, she was used for repatriation service, then scrapped in 1947, 10 months from commissioning to the end of the war. She never launched a single aircraft in combat operations. She existed as a monument to wasted resources and failed strategy. Ryuho began life as the submarine tender Taige, laid down in November 1934. She was converted to a light carrier and commissioned as Ryuho in November 1942. She displaced 13,360 tons, carried 31 aircraft, and could make 26 knots. Ryuho operated in several campaigns early in the war, but she was plagued by mechanical problems. Her machinery was unreliable. Her conversion from submarine tender to carrier had been rushed, leaving structural weaknesses that limited her operational capability. By 1943, she was relegated to training and transport duties. She ferried aircraft to forward bases, transported supplies, trained pilots in relatively safe waters far from American forces. In March 1945, Ryuho was damaged by American carrier aircraft during strikes on Kure. She was under repair when the war ended. The damage wasn't severe, but Japan lacked the spare parts, the skilled workers, and the time to complete repairs. Ryuho sat at her pier, damaged and immobile, while American carrier task forces operated off the Japanese coast with impunity. After the war, she was scrapped in 1946. Junyo, one of the two Hio-class carriers converted from ocean liner hulls, was commissioned in May 1942. She displaced 24,140 tons, carried 53 aircraft, and could make 25 knots. Junyo was one of Japan's more active carriers during the war. She participated in operations in the Aleutians, at Guadalcanal, at Santa Cruz, and at the Philippine Sea. She was damaged multiple times but repaired and returned to service each time. Her luck ran out in December 1944 when she was torpedoed by the submarine USS Sea Devil while operating in the inland sea. The torpedo damage was severe. Normally, a carrier hit that hard would be repaired and returned to service within months, but by late 1944, Japan lacked the resources to repair major damage. Junyo was towed to Sasebo and tied up at a pier. Repair work began but proceeded slowly. By July 1945, she was still under repair, her hull patched but her internal systems non-functional, her flight deck unusable. American carrier aircraft found her at Sasebo during attacks on Kyushu. She was hit by bombs on July 24, 1945. The bombs caused additional damage but didn't sink her. She remained afloat, heavily, damaged, non-operational, until the war ended. She was scrapped beginning in 1946. 4 carriers, 1 obsolete training ship, 1 completed but never operational, 1 under repair and non-functional, 1 severely damaged and awaiting scrapping. That was the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force in July 1945. Meanwhile, American carrier strength continued to grow even as the war entered its final weeks. Task Force 38, the fast carrier task force operating off Japan in July 1945, included 15 Essex-class fleet carriers and 6 Independence-class light carriers. 21 fleet and light carriers in a single task force. That was more carriers than Japan had operated during the entire war. And Task Force 38 was just one of several carrier formations the Americans maintained simultaneously. Additional carriers were deployed in support of operations at Okinawa. More were conducting training exercises off the American coast, preparing new air groups for deployment. Escort carriers operated in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, conducting anti-submarine patrols and supporting amphibious operations. The global reach of American carrier aviation in July 1945 exceeded anything any nation had possessed before or has possessed since, relative to the total naval power available at the time. The closest modern equivalent might be American carrier strength during the Cold War, when the United States routinely operated a dozen or more carrier battle groups simultaneously. But even that doesn't quite capture the dominance. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained a substantial navy that posed credible threats to American carrier operations. In July 1945, Japan had no navy capable of threatening American carriers in any meaningful way. The Americans operated their carriers off the Japanese coast within sight of land, launching strikes against Japanese airfields, ports, and naval bases, with the confidence that no Japanese force could challenge them. Japanese radar detected the American aircraft. Japanese air defense forces scrambled fighters when fuel allowed. But the numbers were so lopsided that individual engagements were meaningless. American carrier strikes in July 1945 involved hundreds of aircraft hitting multiple targets simultaneously. Japanese defenses might shoot down 10 or 15 American aircraft during a major strike. The Americans would return the next day with the same number of aircraft as before, losses replaced overnight from the vast reserves available aboard the carriers and from replacement pools waiting in Guam, Saipan, and Ulithi. On July 24th and 28th, 1945, American carrier aircraft conducted massive strikes against Kure Naval Base, where the remnants of the Japanese fleet lay at anchor. The targets included battleships Haruna, Ise, and Hyuga, heavy cruiser, Tone, light cruisers Oyodo and Kitakami, dozens of destroyers and auxiliaries, and carriers Katsuragi, Ryuho, and Amagi. Amagi was an Unryu-class carrier that had been damaged in March and was under repair at Kure. American aircraft hit her with bombs and torpedoes. She capsized and sank at her pier. Katsuragi survived with minor damage due to camouflage. Ryuho was already damaged, and the additional hits merely confirmed she would never operate again. The strikes destroyed or damaged every major combatant remaining in the Japanese Navy. The ships that survived were immobilized, out of fuel, unable to move, unable to fight. The contrast with American capabilities was absolute. An American Essex-class carrier could launch and recover 90 aircraft in 2 hours. The carrier could sustain flight operations continuously for days, refueling and rearming aircraft between strikes, maintaining combat air patrols, conducting reconnaissance, and still have aircraft available for emergency response to threats. Japanese carriers in July 1945 couldn't launch a single aircraft. They had no aircraft. They had no fuel. They had no trained pilots. They were empty hulls tied to piers, waiting for American bombs to finish what 4 years of war had started. Ozawa commanded this ghost fleet from his headquarters at Yokosuka. His staff still prepared operational plans, still analyzed intelligence, still maintained the bureaucratic machinery of naval command. But everyone understood the reality. The plans were theoretical exercises. The intelligence was cataloguing American strength that Japan could never match. The bureaucracy was maintaining forms and procedures that no longer connected to operational reality. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Between those two events, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. The strategic situation that had been hopeless in July became impossible in August. Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio on August 15th, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the end of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. The combined fleet was dissolved. Vice Admiral Ozawa's command ended. The carriers that remained were inventoried, classified, and scheduled for scrapping. None would ever operate again. In the months after the surrender, American naval intelligence officers conducted extensive interrogations of Japanese naval officers. They wanted to understand Japanese strategy, Japanese decision-making, Japanese intelligence capabilities, and Japanese assessments of American strength. The interrogations were thorough and remarkably candid. Japanese officers, freed from the constraints of wartime propaganda and institutional pressure, spoke honestly about what they knew, when they knew it, and why they made the decisions they made. Ozawa was interrogated multiple times. His insights were considered valuable because he had commanded carrier forces during the most critical battles of the war, and because he had served as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet during the final months. The American interrogators asked Ozawa about many things. They asked about the planning for Philippine Sea and whether he had understood the numerical odds before the battle. Ozawa confirmed he knew the Americans had superior numbers, but believed his aircraft's longer range would compensate. They asked about Leyte Gulf and the decision to use carriers as decoys. Ozawa explained that by October 1944, the carriers couldn't fight effectively, so using them to draw American forces out of position was their only remaining value. They asked about Japanese assessment of American industrial capacity and when Japanese leadership understood the true scale of American mobilization. Ozawa's answer to that question was revealing. He said Japanese intelligence had extensive data about American industrial capacity throughout the war. They knew American steel production, shipyard capacity, and workforce numbers. The raw information was available. But understanding the implications of that information was different. Japanese officers, trained in a system that emphasized careful, methodical development over rapid mass production, couldn't conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America mobilized. They looked at the data and interpreted it through their own assumptions about how industrial systems worked. They saw numbers that indicated America could eventually outproduce Japan, but they didn't grasp that eventually meant months, not years. They didn't understand that American shipyards could go from laying a keel to launching a carrier in 12 to 18 months rather than the 3 to 5 years Japanese construction required. When American interrogators showed Ozawa the actual numbers, 100 to 7 American carriers commissioned during the war, compared to 9 Japanese carriers. He acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had underestimated American construction rates by factors of 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. They knew America would build more carriers. They didn't know America would build so many carriers that individual losses became strategically insignificant. One interrogator asked Ozawa whether Japan would have pursued a different strategy if they had known the true numbers before the war. Ozawa said the strategy would have been different, but whether it would have been successful was another question. Even with perfect intelligence about American industrial capacity, Japan still faced the same resource constraints. The oil embargo was real, the need for resources from Southeast Asia was real, the strategic pressure to act was real. But perhaps, Ozawa suggested, with accurate intelligence about American strength, Japanese planning might have focused on limited objectives. Seize the resources Japan needed, establish defensive positions, negotiate from a position of strength before American industrial power fully mobilized. Instead of planning for a long war of attrition that Japan could never win, plan for a short war with limited goals that might be achievable before America's full industrial capacity came online. It was speculation. The interrogation was happening in October 1945, after the war was over, after the outcome was decided. What might have been was academic. What actually happened was historical fact. The most poignant moment in the interrogations came when an American officer asked Ozawa what he remembered most clearly from his time commanding the combined fleet in the final months of the war. Ozawa thought for a moment. Then he described sitting in his office at Yokosuka in July 1945, reading intelligence summaries about American carrier strength. He remembered the number: 147 carriers. He remembered thinking about the carriers Japan had at the beginning of the war. 9 operational carriers that represented 2 decades of development, careful planning, and institutional knowledge. He remembered thinking about the 4 carriers Japan had left. 1 obsolete, 1 never operational, 2 damaged beyond repair. And he remembered thinking that the war had been lost not because Japanese sailors fought badly, or Japanese officers planned poorly, or Japanese pilots lacked courage. The war was lost because Japan fought an enemy that could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, train pilots faster than Japan could kill them, and produce aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. And that enemy did all of those things while simultaneously fighting a full-scale war on the other side of the world against Germany. The mathematics were absolute. The outcome was inevitable. Everything that happened between December 1941 and August 1945 was just the working out of mathematical certainty. Ozawa lived for 21 more years after the war ended. He died on November 9, 1966, at age 80. He never wrote a memoir. He gave few interviews. He lived quietly in retirement, occasionally consulted by historians researching the Pacific War, but generally avoiding public attention. Those who knew him in his final years said he remained a professional officer to the end, dignified, thoughtful, analytical. He never blamed others for Japan's defeat. He never made excuses. He simply stated facts as he understood them. Japan had fought a war against an enemy with 10 times Japan's industrial capacity. The outcome was determined by that ratio more than by any tactical or strategic decision made during the war. The lesson, if there was one, was that industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance, that wars are won in factories before they are decided on battlefields, that assumptions about enemy capabilities must be tested rigorously against hard data, not filtered through cultural expectations and institutional preferences. Japan had failed to learn that lesson before the war. They paid for that failure with total defeat. The carrier war in the Pacific demonstrated the principle with brutal clarity. Japan began with qualitative superiority, better trained pilots, more experienced carrier crews, more refined doctrine. Those advantages lasted 6 months, perhaps a year. After Midway, American numerical superiority began to assert itself. After Philippine Sea, the outcome was no longer in doubt. By July 1945, The disparity was so vast that comparison became meaningless. 147 American carriers versus 4 Japanese carriers. It was not a contest. It was a mathematical demonstration of industrial dominance. The United States Navy in 1945 represented the full expression of American industrial power applied to naval warfare. The scale was unprecedented and has never been matched. At its peak, the U.S. Navy operated 6,768 ships on VJ Day in August 1945. That included 28 fleet carriers, 71 escort carriers, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, 377 destroyers, and thousands of auxiliaries, landing craft, and support vessels. The Navy had grown from 337,000 personnel in December 1941 to over 3,380,000 personnel by war's end. A tenfold increase in less than 4 years. The carrier force alone represented industrial mobilization on a scale that seemed impossible when the war began. From 8 carriers in December 1941 to 99 carriers by August 1945, that growth was not linear. It was exponential. The rate accelerated as shipyards expanded, as workers learned, as processes improved, as the entire system optimized itself for maximum production. Japan never had the industrial base to compete with that level of mobilization. Even if Japanese planning had been perfect, even if Japanese strategy had been flawless, even if Japanese execution had been without error, the industrial mathematics would have determined the outcome. You cannot win a war of attrition when your enemy produces 10 times more ships, trains 10 times more sailors, and manufactures 10 times more aircraft. The numbers are absolute. The final accounting tells the story in clear terms. Japan commissioned 18 carriers total during the entire war, including pre-war construction. 14 were sunk. 4 survived but were non-operational by war's end. The United States commissioned 107 carriers during the war, not counting pre-war vessels. 6 were sunk. 101 survived the war, and the vast majority were operational and in service when Japan surrendered. The ratio of carriers lost tells part of the story. Japan lost 78% of its carriers. The United States lost 5.6% of its carriers. But the more important ratio is production. America built 12 American carriers for every Japanese carrier commissioned during wartime. 12-1. That ratio, more than any battle or any admiral's decisions or any tactical innovation, explains why the Pacific War ended the way it did. Industrial capacity determined the outcome. Everything else was commentary. The 4 Japanese carriers that remained in July 1945 were monuments to a strategic failure that began before the war started. They represented resources that could have been used elsewhere, steel that could have built destroyers or merchant ships, workers who could have produced aircraft or artillery, time that could have been spent on more productive military preparations. But Japan built carriers because carriers were the dominant naval weapon of the era, and having built them, Japan found they had no fuel to operate them, no aircraft to fly from them, no pilots to fly the aircraft, and no strategic space to use them effectively, even if all those other problems had been solved. The American carriers that operated off Japan in July 1945, by contrast, represented the full flowering of industrial warfare. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were not the products of centuries of naval tradition and careful craftsmanship. They were mass-produced weapons built by workers who learned their skills in months, using techniques that violated traditional shipbuilding practice, constructed at speeds that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. And they worked. They worked because the Americans understood that in industrial warfare, good enough produced quickly beats perfect, delivered slowly. They understood that numbers matter more than individual quality. They understood that wars are won by the side that can sustain losses, and returns stronger, not by the side that fights brilliantly but cannot replace what it loses. Japan learned those lessons too late. By the time Japanese leadership understood that they were fighting a different kind of war than they had prepared for, the outcome was already determined. The carriers were sunk or damaged. The pilots were dead. The fuel was exhausted. The industrial capacity was destroyed. And across the Pacific, American shipyards continued building carriers at rates that Japanese officers still struggled to believe, even when presented with photographic evidence and captured documents confirming the numbers. The story of Japanese Admiral Ozawa, counting 147 American carriers, and knowing Japan had only 4 remaining, is not just a story about carrier production or industrial capacity. It is a story about the consequences of strategic miscalculation, about the dangers of underestimating enemies, about the absolute nature of industrial mathematics in modern warfare, about the gap between what a nation believes it can accomplish and what it actually can accomplish when confronted with an enemy whose capabilities exceed anything anticipated or planned for. Ozawa understood all of this with painful clarity in July 1945. He understood it when he read the intelligence summaries. He understood it when he gave orders to a fleet that existed only on paper. He understood it when he surrendered his command in August 1945 and watched American occupation forces arrive in Tokyo Bay aboard ships that included dozens of carriers, more carriers than Japan had operated during the entire war. The mathematics were absolute, the lesson was clear, and the cost of learning that lesson was total defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.